Sandow.
I am Rosie Peterson, and I'm the chair of the history department at Willamette University, which is a little ways up the road. And I drew the lucky card of chairing this session, I think for a variety of reasons. I first started working with Dante as part of my dissertation research at Yale with one of our panelists, Peter Hawkins. And the dissertation was not on Dante, it was on Bonaventure, who wrote his own Itinerary of a Soul unto God, 13th century Franciscan. And about 10 years later, when I was teaching a humanities senior seminar at Willamette on the comedy, I called Peter asking for fresh approaches that undergraduates would appreciate, and he led me to another one of our panelists' work, Sandow Birk. And I was fortunate enough to be able to help be a faculty curator and exhibit of his work at Willamette's Hallie Brown Ford Museum, and particularly the Inferno part. And this is 2007, 2008, and I brought Sandow and Peter to our campus for a showing of his Dante Inferno's film, which then was newly released, the Victorian Puppet Theater film, for our humanities senior seminar, and we had a Dante symposium. I have continued to teach the comedy regularly, and my interest is in translating it to an undergraduate audience, and most broadly a sort of great books or enduring questions in the humanities perspective. I teach it regularly and have for the last 12 years. I'm very much looking forward to today's panel. And Gina, did you want to make an announcement to start before we even get started? Did you have an announcement before we get started?
You're absolutely right.
Okay. Do you want to go now?
Very
Go.
briefly. Thank you, Wendy. I wanted to mention to those of you who are in Eugene or Portland that in the last week of May, we have an extraordinary series of events taking place on our campus for which we have a few flyers floating around. It's called Musicking, and it is 5 solid days of not just conferences, not just concerts, not just lecture demos, not just master classes, not just workshops, but all kinds of events that engage and involve the public in the notion of musicking as opposed to attending or deferentially listening to other people make music. So I will have a few copies of that little flyer over on the table that you can take as you leave. They do not contain the full program. You have to go online for the scroll of riches, but it's every single event is free and open to the public because of creative and energetic fundraising by the organizers, Holly Roberts and many others in the historical performance practice section of the School of Music and Dance. So that is absolutely not related to Dante, except insofar as music is always related to Dante. So I turn you back over to the Roundtable. I just wanted to get that off my little mental to-do list, and now we will move on to the Roundtable. Thank you, Wendy.
So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then each of them are going to say a few words. Some have prepared longer words than others to begin with, and then we'll get going. So first in line is Sandow Birk. They, by the way, were strictly instructed by Gina to give me 3 sentences max for a bio, so here they are. Sandow Birk is a Los Angeles artist whose work has dealt with contemporary American life. Themes of his projects have included inner-city violence, graffiti, travel, prisons, war, surfing, Dante, and the Holy Quran. He is the recipient of many awards and has exhibited extensively. Next in line is Cristina Carniola, Romance Languages at the University of Oregon. And Cristina completed an MA in Foreign Languages and Literature at the University of Catania in 2015 and is currently finishing an MA in Romance Languages at the University of Oregon. Next August, she will begin a PhD in Romance Languages at Duke University. And today she will share with us a condensed version of her MA thesis, which was awarded the Global Oregon Translation Summer Award in May 2016. And next is Robert Keir. He is professor of composition at the School of Music and Dance at University of Oregon. He is a composer, writer, and filmmaker who's composed 12 symphonies, 3 chamber symphonies, 3 violin concerti, a piano concerto, chamber music, and numerous works for vocal ensembles of all types. He is Philip K. Knight Professor of Music at the University of Oregon School of Music and Dance, where he is the chair of the Composition Department and director of the Oregon Bach Festival Composer Symposium and the Music Today Festival. Recently, his work was recognized by the American Academy of Arts and Letters with an Arts and Letters Award for Distinguished Artistic Achievement. And today he's going to be speaking with us about a new musical setting of the Paradiso. Next in line is Peter Hawkins. Peter is a professor of religion and literature at Yale Divinity School and Yale's Institute of Sacred Music. His teaching and publication have long centered on Dante, with books that include Dante's Testament, Dante, A Brief History, Undiscovered Country, Imagining the World to Come, and co-edited with Rachel Jacoff, Dante's Poets, 12th Century Reflections. Recent essays on the poet appear in Cambridge Vertical Readings in Dante's Comedy, Dante in Context, the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Bible and Arts, Medieval Perspectives, Pedagogy, MLA Approaches to Teaching the Divine Comedy, and Religion and Literature. His book, The Bible and the American Short Story, co-written with Leslie Cushing, is due to appear later in 2017. And finally, at the end of the row is Kevin Regan-Maglione in Romance Languages at the University of Oregon. Kevin received his MA in Italian Studies from Georgetown University and is currently a doctoral candidate in Romance Languages at the University of Oregon, where his dissertation focuses on queer prison testimonies. He is also pursuing a specialization degree in translation. So, welcome to all of you. We're glad you're here. We're looking forward to a great conversation. And I think we'll go in the order on the program, which starts us off with Sandow.
Hi, I'm Sandow. I'm a painter from Los Angeles. I went to art school. I did not study Dante. I finished school in the 90s and started showing paintings about life in Los Angeles. A lot of them had to do with the inner city neighborhoods that I was living in. But in the late 90s, I stumbled on this copy of The Inferno in a local bookstore, and I was enthralled by it because of the Doré illustrations. I just fell in love with them and gradually started reading the poem over about a year and going back and forth and then reading about the poem and just getting sucked in. And eventually I had the idea that I could do a project, a painting project about the Inferno. At the time, and I still have 3 galleries that I work with. I have a gallery in Los Angeles, and I have a gallery in San Francisco, and I have a gallery in New York. And the way it generally works is I have a big art show every year, and it just rotates around so that every 3rd year it's back in the city. I was scheduled to have a show in Los Angeles, and I went to my gallery and proposed doing a series of paintings about the Inferno, and they said that's a great idea. And sort of by coincidence, I got contacted by a printmaker in San Francisco that invited me to do a print project, and I said, well, I'm thinking about this Inferno thing, and they said, oh yeah, let's do a series of prints about the Inferno, and we could like make a box set of them or something, and that seemed to be a really silly idea because why have a box set without the text, which sent me off to trying to get permission to use an English language translation of the text, which went down this whole hole where I was meeting with lawyers to get permission, and at one point this lawyer I was meeting with said, you know, this is a nightmare, you should just do it yourself, as like a joke. And that set me off on the path of trying to make a colloquial slang American version of the text, along with a writer friend of mine named Marcus Sanders. We did. It took quite a while, and during the course of it, I met Peter Hawkins, who became sort of a mentor on the project, emailing me and answering all the questions I had and sort of guiding me along. I created a whole series of one illustration for each of the cantos of the Inferno, and it became a book project and an art show. And the next year, I was scheduled to have a show in San Francisco, and so I said, how about I just do Purgatory and for my gallery in San Francisco? And they said, yeah, that's a great idea. So the idea was to set, all the visuals of what's happening in the poem in contemporary American cities. So as if the idea that, well, Dante is like having this whole afterlife supernatural discussion about the meaning of life and the afterlife, it's all going on in his head, but when you look at the pictures, they sort of contradict the text, and they show him that he's walking around in our everyday world and coming into contact with normal things. This is my painting of hell. You can see it's got images, sort of pan-American images by the volcano on the left is Los Angeles skyline, but then there's remnants of the Golden Gate Bridge, and in the foreground you see part of the World Trade Center in New York after 9/11, sort of Mount Rushmore in the middle. So set off working on Purgatory in the same fashion, doing the translation back and forth with Marcus Sanders and doing images for all the cantos. And since the show was to be in San Francisco, it was a sort of lucky coincidence, because in Purgatory is the whole climbing of the mountain, and San Francisco is the city famous for having hilly streets and cable cars and things. So we working on that and setting it all sort of in San Francisco, and by even more fantastic coincidence, it turns out there's actually a bar in North Beach in San Francisco called the Garden of Eden, which we used for Dante reaching the Garden of Eden. And actually, the night after the art show, we all went to the Garden of Eden to celebrate. But in my version, Dante goes into the Garden of Eden, where he meets faith, hope, and charity. And finds the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And meets Beatrice. And then we carried on to Purgatory, which was pre-scheduled to be in New York. So in the poem where he rises up to the sky, the natural place that we rise up to the sky is at the airport. So this is Dante at LAX. And then he goes to New York. But this whole project took me about 5 years, and over the course of it, at the beginning working in Inferno, I was sort of new to the whole thing and unfamiliar and nervous and really reverential. And then by the middle, I got more confident, and by the end, I started to get more bold, and the project became more sort of about the visuals contradicting Dante. And so where Dante talks about who the small groups of people that are allowed to get to heaven, in our version, you see the pictures start to show he's traveling to all different cities around the world. He's starting to see images of all different faiths. There's Mary made up of all the different sort of Hindu faith symbols. And finally, he reaches the Rose of Heaven, which is Mecca. And this is the final painting of the city of paradise, which is, if you could see it, it's a 12-foot long painting, but if you could see it, all the buildings are they're iconic buildings from different cities around the world, so it's sort of a mega city made up of all the different languages and such. It was printed in a really high-end, really beautiful edition of 100 lithograph books by Trillium Press in San Francisco. And then they came out in paperback version by Chronicle Books. It was quite a big hit, thanks to people like you. And it led to me creating a movie. It became an art show. It traveled to several institutions. This is at the San Jose Museum of Art. Here's part of it, what it looked like inside. I did paintings on the walls to go with it. It went to Phoenix. It went to, it went several places. I sort of have, in my career, I sort of have this thing where I get a small idea and it becomes a giant project sort of unwillingly or something. It gets out of control. Right around this point, when the books were just being finished, I was at a barbecue party in Hollywood with some friends of mine, and a small group of us were working the arts, and we had made a little movie before, and somebody said, hey, we should all make another movie. And I said, hey, how about Dante? And they said, I don't know, maybe. We don't have any money. And then one of my friends is this guy named Paul Zaloom, who is a puppeteer by lifelong profession, and he used to have a children's TV show called Beekman's World that used to be on TV, and he would do science experiments for kids. It would be on in the morning. And he said, well, I only want to be involved in the movie if we do it with puppets. And we said, that's a horrible idea. But he gradually sort of convinced us through his knowledge of the history of puppets that, Doré was in the late 1800s and that we could use this type of puppetry from the 1800s. And we embarked on yet another foolish mission to make a feature-length film of Dante's Inferno, all made out of paper puppets, which we did. It took us about 2 years. We raised some money privately, and it came out and premiered at the Slam Dance Film Festival across the street from Sundance. And that's why I'm here. Thanks.
I was on spring vacation in Los Angeles and met somebody at a party who said, you do Dante? And I thought, I've come away from doing Dante. I'm here on vacation. There's this extraordinary show at a gallery on such-and-such street. It's a completely new Dante. I thought, I'm going to do it. Make it new. Move on. It is a new account of everything old. Matisse, Advance, and a great deal more than that. Wallace Stevens, Ezra Pound. Yeah, why not? Spring vacation. I'm free. And I went into the gallery, and there were these couple of large paintings and an extraordinary array of other art. And I spent, I would say, 2 hours there. And at the end of it, I spoke to the person behind the desk and said, I really want to be in touch with the artist. Is it possible? And she said, not directly, but you may be in touch with him through me. Okay, per me si va, right? So I wrote Sandow a letter of interest and appreciation, and he wrote back, and it began a kind of wonderful association. I became a kind of Sandow Birk camp follower. The following summer, I was in San Francisco, so I went to Purgatory. And then he did me the honor of asking me to contribute an essay to the Paradiso volume, which would be not specifically on Paradiso, but my Dantista impression of the whole work. And I loved doing it. I remember sending him the draft, and there were some things in it that he didn't like. So I said, why don't you just respond to these things, and I'll incorporate them in the essay, which I did. And it was just the thought of being in correspondence with a person about whom I'm writing was absolutely thrilling. Talk about live coverage, live feed. So it has been wonderful to be part of this kind of translation that Sandow has done. Kind of adaptation in text, a kind of visual retelling, a dialogue with the poem, becoming more and more bold as it moves to its conclusion, where the city of God, the Candida Rosa, is Mecca, prophetic of his American Quran, which is the other huge work that followed his work on the Commedia. Most of the translation that I'm involved in is at the Yale Divinity School, where I deal with one of the foundational acts of translation in the East as well as in the West, which has to do with the New Testament's translation of the Hebrew Bible, about which I have, as a Christian, really mixed feelings. The way in which continuing the tale can also be the rewriting of the tale, I don't like that. Where fulfillment of the text, the Christian way of doing it, can mean the supersession of the text, I don't like that. Interestingly, when I went to seminary and studied the Bible really for the first time, it was the Hebrew Bible that I fell in love with. And as time moved on, when I was at Yale studying for my orals in the English department, and Nancy Vickers, for a number of years, president of the Dante Society of America, came to my carrel in Sterling Library and said, "Petey, we have to go to this Dante course. John Ferchero has come from Cornell. We have to go to there." I said, "Nancy, Dante is not an English poet. Dante is not going to be on my orals. I've tried twice before, once when I was a freshman, once as a junior in college, to study Dante, not interested. I have to prepare for when I'm going to write my dissertation on the Fairy Queen." You laugh. So I went to that first class with Nancy, she's a great persuader, and fell in love with the poem that I had no interest in the first two readings. I think it was partly that I was primed for a poem about love. I was in love for the first time. I didn't understand it. It was big. Well, here was a poem about love in the biggest sense. There was also a fabulous teacher, John Ferchero. So I, as an auditor, stayed with it for the entire year, using my John D. Sinclair bilingual translation of the poem. But what I was convinced by the end of that first year of study as an auditor, that I had to learn Italian. I didn't want to be viewing the poem through a glass darkly. I wanted to see it as best I could face to face. So I went to Perugia, 2 years later went to Siena for summer programs, have a very shaky grasp of spoken Italian to my great sorrow, but a love for the language and an absolute love for the poem. And it's amazing to me the way students, whether they were freshmen at Yale or graduate students at the Divinity School, get it. At Yale, we read the poem together for a year and read a lot of other stuff that Dante read too as part of that journey. One of the things that impresses me is the way in which he is himself translating the theology of his time and the evangelical impulse of the Franciscans and the Dominicans in order to present in the vulgar tongue all of that recondite thought, all that arcana verba, to make it live. And one of the things I realized with Ariel, where are you, Ariel? Where is Ariel? Oh, there she is. Ariel's presentation today with this extraordinary triptych. I want to know more. Thank God I had a guide in her. I would have been lost otherwise. The pilgrim is never alone, right? Except for the first 50 lines of the poem. Miserere di me. Help me, Ariel. Help me see what I'm seeing. But it made me realize, reading the translation of that painter, of the Commedia, that what was missing is the thing that keeps me on board and grabs my students too, the narrative. A person who is lost, who is found, who makes his way down and up, who in encounters and in conversations with other poets, with other texts, enters into a universe of discourse that transforms him. And that narrative, in one way, is what reading the poem does. It translates oneself. At least it has for me.
It's so great to be here and to be part of this wonderful community. As a composer, I have a particular love of Dante and all of the music that runs through Dante. Everything that he ever wrote, and I believe everything that he ever envisioned, contains a kind of music that's visionary at its root, and that inspired me and my collaborators to co-create a project of interdisciplinary sacred music drama, which was commissioned through Notre Dame University through the Sacred Music program. and funded completely by Mellon Foundation, with some additional funding from other sources as well eventually. The coordinator of the project and the person who initiated it was Carmen Helena Tellez, who eventually became the producer and music director of the project. The idea was to create a journey of the commedia through multimedia art. That would be music, obviously literature, staging, video, lighting, and other elements as well that I'll speak about in a moment. The team at its root included, obviously, Carmen, myself. She invited me to be the composer, although I also have a background in, as a writer and a filmmaker. And then the librettist, Robin Kirkpatrick, who I think we all know, an amazing translator of Dante, and as I got to know him, an amazing human being who inspired me enormously in every way. I'll talk in a moment about our process for co-creating the libretto, which was primarily his creation, but I joined with him as a composer to help shape it as a text for music. Also, in that beginning group was the theater director Anton Juan, who's from the Philippines and a faculty member at Notre Dame. And so we had actually a kind of intercultural group. Carmen is from Venezuela, myself from United States, Robin from Britain, and then, of course, as I just said, Anton from the Philippines. And this was wonderful as well because it gave a kind of, you could say, interactive quality to everything that we did, bringing our own background, not only culturally but also artistically in many ways that we couldn't even describe, the kind of connections between us, and then also the juxtapositions, which were very important in crafting this work. There were strictures from the beginning, and that's wonderful. One was physical context, and we started with the idea of creating this work, or rather co-creating it. I like to think of it as co-creation. Co-creating it in a space that was large as the Hult Center here, as large as Davies in San Francisco, or depending on where you live, whichever hall is the largest one, that's how large this hall was, and kind of a medium acoustic. And the idea was to have the journey occur within this great sounding space, and to have choreography and everything that we could bring to bear to bring Commedia to life. Well, that didn't quite work out. Somewhere, several months later, the idea was to move it, for a lot of reasons, logistical and otherwise, to a space that was about the wettest space you've ever heard. Think of a great cathedral with an 11-second ring. Now multiply it by 1, 2, or 3 factors, depending on where you're standing. And that was part of an arts center, and it was going to be this great open space onto a river, which at night is lit in a very particular way, suggesting Inferno, for example. And during the day is very different, which might suggest, in certain ways, Paradiso. So that was wonderful, and I was very excited about going there and visiting. But just before I arrived, it was put into a different space, completely different. A small box, as a matter of fact, a black box theater that was about the driest space you've ever heard. Think of a sensory deprivation chamber. Then think of that chamber with surround sound. So 16 sets of speakers mounted in the walls of that chamber. Aha! So I thought I could create a cathedral or any other acoustic inside of that space. I could transform it. The walls could dissolve. We could be in as many places as we want within the course of the journey, because added to whatever sound is being projected through those speakers would be various forms of reverberation, reverb. And that could transform the sense of space, place, and could transform the meaning of what we were actually experiencing through sung music. So that was very exciting, but it took us a while to get there. Why am I telling you all this? These are translations for the composer. These are translations. Every time that changed, it's a new translation of the work. The journey had to be taken again. I had to take it from the beginning, even though I was asked to compose for the Paradiso, I had to take the whole journey to ensure that it was organic. Now there was another constriction. The duration could only be 60 minutes. That's interesting. Paradiso is a rather long text and rather involved. And the libretto itself is a lyrical meditation and reflection on Paradiso, so it's not every word, was never intended to be so. But creating Paradiso in 60 minutes, that's a challenge. Then there was another stricture. I had to set every word of the libretto. Nothing could be changed. Nothing could be reordered, and nothing could be done to alter it. And then there was another stricture. The music had to be ideal for song, meaning a solo, duo, trio with instruments, choral song that could be a cappella or accompanied, video. Now, music for video and music for concert, they're different things. It had to also work for lighting, dance, various forms of choreography, movement through the space, and staged narrative. In other words, it had to be a fusion work of some kind. Well, in a way that works with Dante for all the reasons we've been discussing today. But again, these are all translations of various kinds. And how to make a single work that's organic and complete, given these strictures. Music, in fact, ends up being the tie that binds and brings all of these aspects together, and therefore creates another layer of translation that arises from the nature of music itself. So the work from the beginning needed to be multidimensional in order to incorporate all of these aspects. And I conceived it from the beginning as a sphere within spheres, within spheres, within spheres, much like the image that we saw earlier today, the image of Paradise in Ariel's presentation, that great painting with what looks like concentric circles, but in the sense of what I was creating was concentric spheres, and spheres that actually change and transform, because the subtitle of the libretto is Transformation and Transfiguration. So it was never Paradiso, but always Paradiso, Transformation, and Transfiguration. So my idea from the beginning was to create a work in which the musical journey embodies the archetype of transformation and of transfiguration. There are many layers of translation within this work, starting with the vision of Dante, translated into literature, translated into English by Robin Kirkpatrick, then Robin Kirkpatrick translating that into a lyrical meditation and reflection upon the Paradiso, then translating it into music. That was my job, but that means giving it the dimension of time, because time is not a dimension per se in any of those other translations, but in music, suddenly we inhabit the world of time, and in this case, 60 minutes of time. And then from music, translating into video, dance, lighting, staging, multiple transformations on various levels. So the work could be heard, could be experienced as a series of unfolding translations of Dante through all of these domains, which in my vision are one domain embodying the archetype of unity. So there's no separation between any of these, even though the translation is particular and took place in sequence. But in a way, this work overrides the nature of separate entities that are being brought together. They come together as one entity from the beginning. The text and music being completely wedded because in co-creating the libretto with Robin, the music and the text were never separate. I actually composed the music as we were co-creating the libretto, and then wrote it down, which is actually my way of composing. I don't create by putting a lot of materials on a desk and then somehow bringing them together like a puzzle. In fact, I create the work internally from beginning to end. If I'm writing a text as a writer, or if I'm co-creating a text with a librettist, in this case Robin Kirkpatrick, I'm co-creating text and music together as an entity, as one, so they're never separate. And that in turn then gives a more organic set of possibilities to the video artist, the dancer, the lighting designer, the person who's doing staging, because they feel that connection between music and text. They're never separate. In the musical domain, there are also layers of translation. As a multimedia work, as I said, there's a translation into time. There's a translation also of the work which was conceived as a multimedia work into a work that could be performed as an oratorio. It could be performed as a concert piece without any staging, or it could be done as a concert piece with a little bit of staging, semi-staging. I conceived it so all these were possible, these different translations. And furthermore, it could be performed with any of the 17 scenes being done on its own. They all will work as a self-contained entity or organically connected, not only all together as 17 scenes, but in any direction that you want to put them. So the scenes may be extracted to create a suite, if you wish, and in any direction as well, depending on how you wish to do that and what journey you wish to trace through the work itself. So just a few remarks about the oratorio. As I said, it's in 17 scenes, and it was created as a libretto that is a lyrical meditation and reflection. It's not a direct extraction of lines from Dante in any way, shape, or form. It was a meditation on Dante. And there are lines from Dante that are interwoven, and other text as well, some in Italian, but primarily in English, all in Robin Kirkpatrick's version, of course, but he also translated his own version for music. So there's a translation there as well. And in many ways, this text from scene 13 of his libretto expresses the relationship of music to the text itself. And I'm quoting from his libretto. Curling like incense born on summer dust, in love through all the stirrings of creation, here interspiraling, sing Gloria in excelsis Deo. And this notion of interspiraling became one of the central means of co-creating music and text together. Because just as Dante's Paradiso is the source for the musical work, in the musical work there are a series of 5 sources that are woven together that bear the same relationship as Dante's text to the libretto, but now musical sources to this new work that I created from those sources. The Prelude from J.S. Bach's Suite No. 1 in G major, which is one of my favorite pieces. Do you know, any of you, the Suite in G major? It's one of the glories of all of Bach's work. To me, it's a very pure, refined music, an unaccompanied piece for cello. And it's one of the pieces of earthly music that's closest to music of the spheres for me. When I got to a certain place inwardly, imagining and creating inwardly the music, I got to a certain place and was very silent in a meditative mode of reflection. And that's what I heard. I heard the Bach, the beginning of it, which suggested to me that I needed to explore it and weave it together with the introduction of the piece and proceed from there. Then I discovered, as I envisioned the work further, that I was hearing inwardly different chants from throughout history. And somehow they had found me, just as I had found them, a Gloria and a Sanctus from Mass 1 of the Lux et Origo, or Light and Source Mass. It's a magnificent piece of plain chant, Gregorian plain song, and it's a Mass for Easter morning, that is, embodying the resurrection and the spirit of the resurrection. So it flowed directly into the work, and I found that it could be written in counterpoint with Bach's suite. So a single cello line and plain chant written in a completely different era could actually be composed together, interspiraling, interwoven into one music. Something was up, and I decided to experience that in another way. I did a meditation on all 3 of those elements together And 2 other chants emerged from that I heard inwardly. 2 Marian chants, the Ave Maria from the Offertorium in Mode 8 and the Salve Regina in solemn tone. And these are, of course, on the theme of the mother and embody this quotation from the libretto. All these resemble Mary, our mother, her own face in likeness of the face of her son. So indeed, these chants and this piece of Bach found me through the process of co-creating this work. And then I took those and wove them together to create polyphony from single lines that were written completely independently from one another in different eras of history, which in fact suggests to me some of the internal workings of Dante's journey itself. It's very much part of his own journey, as you know, different layers of time having different meanings through the exploration of these aspects. And the same is through this music. So the process of writing the music is completely reflective of the text itself and in fact embodies it. This was very exciting for me also to share with Robin Kirkpatrick and discuss this, because this then enabled us to go further and explore different layers of meaning that normally one might not be able to do in creating a work of this kind. But the collaboration ended up being a very close one, and one in which we found that literally on every point of our reflection together, we were absolutely in alignment and absolutely together. It was incredible that in his libretto as well, there was a sense of music. Even though he's very modest about his own musical abilities, but there was music at the heart and at the center of his libretto, which was more really than a lyrical meditation, but it really was actually a work of music. What a composer does when one receives a libretto of that kind, it doesn't have all of the different aspects, subheadings that you would see in a libretto. It doesn't say this is an aria, for example, or this is a chorus, or anything of the sort. But one works with the librettist and then shapes it, literally co-creates it. So it goes from being a literary work to becoming a musical work, to becoming something that I call text for music, where text and music are one, completely unified in every aspect. In order for that to happen, you have to have a librettist who's completely open and flowing with the nature of music itself and the creation of music. And that's very, very rare to find. How many of you listen to opera fairly frequently or somewhat frequently? So you probably know that there's been a bit of an issue in contemporary American opera. It's been very hard to pair opera composers with librettists. For the very reasons I've just been saying, that it's hard to find writers and or poets and composers who can communicate in the way that I just described. So I felt very, very fortunate to be working with Robin in this way. So just to finish, that in the sense that I've been discussing it, the gradual unfolding and interplay of the sources I just described, the 4 chants and the piece by Bach, embody one of the central themes in Dante's Paradiso. It's from scene 16 of the libretto itself. And all powers of high imaging here failed. But now my will and my desire were turned as wheels that move in equilibrium by love that moves the sun and other stars. The music was intended from the beginning, and text together as text for music as one, to be a living out of the archetypes of unity, transformation, and transfiguration. If you look at the score, the work could be read, if you read music in a certain way and go to the level of meaning of the music, as a kind of work that is a living out of those archetypes. It's not just something to be heard, but something to be pondered and explored in the way that the structures unfold and relate to each other, and how they relate to the text of the Paradiso. It's a translation from these archetypes through sound into a music that offers new possibilities for exploring the inner life of Dante's Paradiso. And for me, that was the essence, is to always be emanating in my musical exploration from the inner life of Dante's Paradiso and Robin's libretto as one, never separate, but always embodying the unity that's in Dante, but also in various forms of translation of Dante, that same archetype of unity, which gives rise to music, also from the music of Dante itself. Thanks.
I don't know if you can. Okay, that's all. Okay, so as you know, and you can understand from my last name, I'm not American. I come from Sicilian. That's why I'm going to talk today about the translations of the Divine Comedy into Sicilian dialect. Before coming here, I didn't even know that there were translations of the Divine Comedy into Sicilian, and so it was a surprise for me and also a way of feeling closer to my hometown, my island. And so first of all, I was trying to collect all the translations that have been done so far, and so as you can see, the first one and the most old is the one that was done by Fra Paolo Principato, and this is like a legend because I was trying to find it this summer while I was working on my project, but I couldn't find it, and so it is recorded, but I think that it is for sure in some of the we have a lot of monasteries in Catania, and I think that for sure it has to be there, or in Messina, or in Palermo in the archive. And then, as you can see, we have other 9 translations. These are only the one these are the one that are of the complete work, so the 3 canticles, and they are 10. But we have other 6 that are only of some canticles, like Paradiso or like Inferno, and so I had to decide which one is going to be my aim, which one I'm going to analyze for my thesis, for my project. And it wasn't because I wanted to decide and to prioritize someone and not work with another, but the problem was availability, because as you know, in Italy we have a law that when a book is older than 100 years, you cannot take it out from the library, so it was a problem of availability. And so I decided to work with Tommaso Cannizzaro. This is the most famous one. And it was published in Messina in 1904. And then I selected also Filippo Guastella, Giovanni Girgenti, and Padre Domenico Canalella. So the first time that I read about the translations of the Divine Comedy was into an article in La Repubblica. This article was published in 2008, and so it started with this question: per quale motivo mettersi a rischio in una simile quanto disperata impresa? So as you can see, the translation of the Divine Comedy into a dialect, and this was specifically talking about the Sicilian dialect, was considered risky. And one of the best reply can be found in the dedications and in the preface of the translations that I was analyzing. So, for example, this was the dedication of Cannizzaro's translation. And so he says, ai comuni di Sicilia, questa versione nel loro linguaggio collettivo. So he's speaking about a collective language. But in Sicily, we don't have a unique dialect. We have at least 5 major dialects, and then each town has a different variety. Della visione dantesca dedica il traduttore perché la diffusione del sacro poema nel popolo voglia rialzare l'idioma. So he wanted to elevate the dialect, the Sicilian dialect. Culture, la cultura e lo spirito. E contribuisca mercé il dialetto che iniziò il volgare illustre. So he is making reference to the connection that we can find also in the Vulgari Eloquentia, when Dante says that the first and the most prestigious dialect was the Sicilian one, and al più largo e sano sviluppo della coscienza nazionale. So he wanted through his translation to make the Sicilian feel part of Italy as a whole. And another one, this is the dedication of Giovanni Girgenti. It is interesting for me that he says at the end, il ritrovare se stessa nel singolare medievale linguaggio di Dante, il quale sommo poeta io considero il principe dei poeti dialettali. So he is talking about Dante, and I don't know, maybe it's because in Italy, you know, when you study literature, there is this canon. And when you think about the canon, you think about Dante as a king. And here he is presented like a prince. And he is presented like the prince of the dialectal poets. So he is making a reference to the Tuscany dialect, that the variety that Dante was using in his translation, as one of the dialects that were spoken in Italy at that time. And so he is at the same time making a reference to his own dialect and saying they are at the same level. I'm not going to do something that is risky at all, because I'm translating from a dialect into another dialect. And so now to give you a flavor of the translations that I was analyzing, that I've been analyzing. First of all, I think that it would be nice to listen to some of the tercets in my dialect. And maybe I'm going to start with Cannizzaro, that is considered the best translator of the Divine Comedy into Sicilian. And then we can, I don't know if we will have enough time to speak about my analysis, but if you want, if you have any particular question, we can talk about it in the question and answer. And so let's start. Era di nostra vita a metà giunto, quando in tono scuro bosco mi ritrovai, perdendo la vita gitta, già du punto. Quando era brutto a dirlo e dura assai, sta spirubusco, sarvaggio e sparagnoso, trema a pensarlo come dai tremai. Lo morire non è più doloroso, ma predire lo buono che da c'era, di quanto è visto da dirò più. So, as you can see, the first, so I put also you can find also the original, so that we can make some reference. So in this translation in particular, as you can see, we are losing the word cammin, and he is inserting also a verb that is absent in the first verse of the original version. And so we have era junto. This gives also a sort of agency, and it is adding something to the original text. As you can see also reading the other translations, they are trying to explain, to make the poem more intelligible for common people. And so while they are translating, they are also glossing. And so, for example, one of the example that is the most shocking for me was in the second one, in Guastella, he is adding una nottata. So he is adding during the night. This is not present in the original one. So he is giving us a temporal reference, and he is placing, he is guiding the reader through the text, but we lose at the same time the oscuro, the dark forest, because in the second verse we have un bosco. And he is adding also sperso e confuso. So he was lost and he was puzzled. So he is glossing at the same time the text. And this is also, for example, we can see it in the last verse of the second tercet, when he says, e tremo della testa ghirioso. So he was shaking from the head to the feet. So he's trying to give he's depicting, he's describing it with visual images. And so it's a kind of, they are trying to push the dialect and to see which boundaries they can defy, because at the same time they are trying to, there are some words that they couldn't express in Sicilian, and so they were Sicilianizing these words, and other times they were Italianizing Sicilian words. So, for example, we don't say non è più like in Cannizzaro. In Sicilian would be non è più. So, for this reason, as you can see, at the same time, we can, if we had to think about losses and gains in these translations, we could say that they are trying to demonstrate that the Sicilian dialect could be the best dialect to translate the Divine Comedy, and they managed to keep then the decasyllabic verse and the rhyme scheme, as you can see. But at the same time, this is something that plays a big role in the decision of the words, or in the decision of the words that they selected to translate it. So I think that if you have questions about it, we can talk about it in the Q&A, and that's all for me.
Okay, first of all, let's address this. So I had something typed out, and I'm going to go a little rogue until I get to my close reading, so please bear with me. I was really inspired by the opening remarks and sort of how we need to give agency to translators. And so the title of my presentation is Dantisti and their Lucifer, or Luciferi. And what I attempt to do is to demystify sort of the enigmatic relationship that Dantisti have with their translations. I feel that we tend to put them on a pedestal as if their translation will be the most faithful, most dutiful, and rather, as it was pointed out, there are lexical choices that give away how they interpret the text that I feel we need to give agency to. And so I am actually going to look at 3 different translations specifically the 34th canto in Inferno by Gina and Robert Hollander, Mark Musa and Robert Kirkpatrick. And I'm going to delve into translational theory, something that may scare some of us, especially by looking through Walter Benjamin. So I promise I will guide you through it through my own readings, mostly to see what kinds of priorities and authorial conceptions come in when comparing these translations, in order to appreciate the tension or harmony that the Dantean Lucifero and the English Satans may or may not have. So in the beginning, I would like to look at the first stanza, is that the introduction to Lucifero, in which the pilgrim and Lucifer meet, and it's the following stanza that Virgil warns, lo imperador doloroso regno, da mezzo il petto uscì fuor della ghiaccia, e più con un gigante io mi convegno. The canto goes on to reveal, for those of you who may not be familiar with this canto, a gigantic and bizarre monster that is trapped up to his chest in ice. He has one head with 3 differently colored faces, red, white, yellow, and black. He also drools a bloody mixture while he chews on 3 sinners, and he cries. For the entire encounter, he's actually mute. Due to their extensive scholarly training in studying the comedy, these 3 dantisti and 1 poet imposed their own criticism of the poem through their translations, not necessarily the commentary, but through their translations. And this critical approach isn't to find fault in the translations, but rather to reveal the internalized and externalized anxieties exhibited in their work and how they translate the comedy. And thus I want to remove the enigmatic relationship that they have to the text. And so in order to do that, we must look at Walter Benjamin's influential essay, The Translator's Task. For those of you who have read this, I can sympathize with how difficult it is. So instead of reproducing the original work, Benjamin regarded the function of translation as an art form. That is to say, a translator is creating a completely new artistic production in translation. This means that the original work should be filtered through the translation instead of following the previous school of thought, a word-for-word correlation. The essential component to Benjamin's theory is pure language, which is an ephemeral composite of all languages. Benjamin defines pure language as a phenomenon that, quote, consists rather in the fact that in each of them, languages, as a whole, one and the same thing is intended. This cannot be attained by any of them alone, however, but only by the totality of their mutually complementary intentions. Pure language, end quote. Pure language is thus an entity that contains all linguistic aspects of every language and every possible combination of expression. It is the translator who accesses and indicates this linguistic singularity while laboring between the 2 languages. The translator, according to Benjamin, should be a permeable catalyst through which pure language can substantiate itself. He writes, true translation is transparent. It does not obscure the original, does not stand in its light, but rather allows pure language, as if strengthened by its own medium, to shine fully on the original, end quote. It seems that in this assertion, a translator must not manipulate the original work and must let the translation and original shine together harmoniously. This would problematize the actual role of the translator and would contradict Benjamin's claim that there must not be a word-for-word translation when he writes that it does not obscure the original. Benjamin reflects on this inconsistency by arguing for the original author's intent, but also emphasizing the translator's authorial claim. Quote, just as fragments of a vessel, in order to be fitted together, must correspond to each other in the minutest details, but need not resemble each other. So, translation, instead of making itself resemble the sense of the original, must fashion in its own language, carefully in detail, a counterpart to the original modes of meaning, end quote. In other words, the translation is not a carbon copy of the original, but it is a manipulated version that works congruently with the original work. Thus, these 3 seemingly exhaustive, exact translations of Dante reveal, via their own linguistic choices and understandings of the poems, that the poem is filtered through the translators. Translators will make different choices while moving from the original language to the target language, And so it's this unique perception of the text that exposes itself within this difference of opinion. Due to time constraints, I will focus on one verse and one verse only in particular, and that is Lucifer's and his Regno's introduction. So here we have the Hollanders, the emperor and the woeful kingdom, Musa, the king of the vast kingdom of all grief, and the emperor of all those of gloom, Kirkpatrick. The description's introduction is debatably the first crucial step into leading the reader to envision Lucifer. One of the translators diverge from the original imperador. Musa translates this as king. Kirkpatrick and the Hollanders follow a more literal translation and utilize emperor. The semantic difference is subtle yet significant. Emperor follows both the original Italian and implies a singular entity ruling over a group of nations. This distinction may reveal how Musa views Lucifer, a king under the empire of God, or it could be a linguistic choice because Dante writes Lo imperador del doloroso regno, using kingdom and king, in Musa's case, could be his choice to keep the imagery cohesive. The various translations of the doloroso regno present meaningful difference as they employ woeful kingdom, the Hollanders, the vast kingdom of all grief, Musa, and all of these realms of gloom, Kirkpatrick. The Hollanders, again, seem to rely on a literal translation, but Kirkpatrick pluralizes regno. Kirkpatrick's perception of hell is evident. Each circle is a realm over which Lucifer rules, full of various shades of despair or gloom. Musa emphasizes spatiality by introducing a new adjective, vast. Lucifer rules over a large kingdom that extends over many circles. Musa's employment of grief is intriguing as it suggests that all of the inhabitants, including Lucifer, are suffering the loss of what they could have had in paradise. Within the introductory stanza, a close examination of the three translations has demonstrated three different kinds of hellish overlords. A Satan that rules over a sovereign nation that is full of great distress, Hollanders. A king that maintains a capacious kingdom full of regretful sinners, Musa. And an emperor that rules over different levels of despondency, Kirkpatrick. Their translations communicate their relationship to the poem and with Dante as a whole as they carefully navigate through transposing the imagery and poetic detail into English. The translation process is not a simple word-for-word codification, but rather the text must speak through the translation. Some resistance to this process can be found in the Hollanders' translation, as much as I admire their translation, and yet some of their decisions unveil their creative liberties. This adds to Benjamin's theorization that translation, as an art form, must assert itself through its own understanding and yet always be in dialogue with the original. The Hollanders, Musa, and Kirkpatrick are particularly sensitive to the poetic wonders that the original poem offers to literature and, in their own way, do just service to the poem. Many translations succeed brilliantly in highlighting certain elements in the poems, and they also fall short in other modes. This is why a comparative examination of the three Dantistes and one poet's elaboration is helpful in considering what is gained and lost in translation. Is the balance between Lucifer and Lucifero struck or lopsided? Even though the translators have access to all of the academic discourse on various understandings of the last canto, they achieve creating a new emperor, or king, to English as they reflect on the imperador in Italian. Thank you.
Thank thank you for those rich and very varied presentations. It would be impossible to try to draw them all together in any type of a comment, and so I think we should just open the floor to questions and observations and thoughts. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for Sandow Birk. Your Dante images are incredibly profound engagements with Dante, but they're also engagements with Gustave Doré. And I was wondering if you think of that as being sort of the task of the translator, how you think about sort of what you're doing with Doré, because you're obviously making changes and engaging his images. So I wonder if you could reflect on sort of the fact that you're sort of visualizing both Dante and Gustave Doré.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I started off being so enthralled by Doré's, images, especially because he took sort of the, me coming to the poem with not looking at much stuff beforehand, but he took the sort of ethereal, dreamy text and made it into this really concrete place of like specific dimensions and the specific heights of stairs, and every place was very solid and rendered in like a world that you could imagine. And so that was inspiring to me. And then, I used him as the basis for my work. But then going into Paradiso, where he didn't do every canto, by the time I got there, I was bold enough to go on to my own things.
Were you thinking about the American Quran project already when you were finishing Paradiso, or had you not started thinking about it because of the celestial roads being Mecca? Were you already? Did you have that other project already in mind?
No, it was several years. After I finished the Divine Comedy project, I did a 3-year project all about the war in Iraq, which was going on at the time.
I have a question for everyone, which you can answer at your leisure, and that is, what did you hear from your other panelists that resonated with you, or that made you sit up and say howdy? But my own question is for Robert here, given that there's an old batuta that talking about music is like dancing about architecture, and what is the stage of the performance now? Has it taken place? Has it been recorded? Will it be available to hear? Because we get to look at the images of Sandow's adaptations, translations, and not yours yet. What is?
Yes, it was done in that wonderful theater that I described, with the box with the 16 speakers and every kind of acoustic phenomenon you could imagine coming through those speakers at various points, transforming and transfiguring according to the unfolding of the libretto and the journey itself. That was in November of 2016, and then we recorded it, and now it's being mixed. And you can imagine that the actual mixing of it, the final, after you've edited it, and then mixing it is very complicated. Also, I didn't say this because I didn't want to go on for too long, given our time constraints. But at the very end, there's a soundscape of bells, and those occur in the very final 3 cantos as the piece is unfolding into the upper realms of heaven. And it's very beautiful, actually, at that point in the libretto. I'll just share this with you. After the part that I read, all powers of high imaging here failed, but now my will and my desire were turned as wheels that move in equilibrium by love that moves the sun and other stars. That's Dante singing. Then I, changing myself, mutando mio, io muto, I mute, mutando mi io, move, l'amor che move. That's what I was given. So the idea of making a soundscape, and with the bells having begun 2 scenes before, there's a kind of fusion that's happening and a transfiguration at the end, changing from a vocal sound and instrumental sound to something that is just the pure resonance of bells themselves, which are heard in a different way. It's like you're inside of the bells because you literally are created a spheroid space with the 16 pairs of speakers. Obviously, that's very hard to mix in stereo, so you have to find an equivalent. Another translation, and so recording and technology gives us an opportunity to do that, to translate the work still further, and that's what we're in the process of doing. So it's audio only in the final, yeah. The video can't really be done because it's, it could be done in the new 360-degree video. Has anybody seen some of those 360? They now have a camera which can shoot in all directions at once, and you can inhabit the space from inside of the space in which it is being photographed or videoed. And you can move around. With your cursor, you can move around in that space. And that's something that could be done with a work of this kind. But it's a technology that's just beginning now. We didn't have access to it then. But that might be something for the future. My hope is to have the work done now as an oratorio in a concert setting, not only as a pure oratorio without any staging, but also as a semi-staged oratorio, and to experience it in that ways, in those two ways, and perhaps others as well. There's already been 2 performances of it in versions that were suites, scenes that were drawn from the oratorio, very different, by the way, one from the other, and the work was conceived to be able to be done that way. We hope eventually, yes. Yeah, that's the idea. We're hoping. Thank you for the question. Yeah. Yes? No, I haven't. Oh. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'd be very interested in experiencing that. Of course, seeing the score, and then if there, I don't know if it's been recorded or. Right. Oh, I'm going to take a look. That's. Oh, great. Oh, I would really love to explore that. But I was going to say, because your question had 2 parts to it. First, you were asking us as panelists if we sensed connections or, by implication, differences as well. And I wanted to say that I sensed a deep bond, actually, with both Peter Hawkins and Sandow Birk, that our work really is remarkably similar and comes from the same, I would say, archetypal realm. Because in your work, for example, Sandow, I experienced a kind of fusion that comes from a sense of unity. I didn't sense, in the journey of it, at least what I was seeing. Now, of course, I haven't experienced the whole thing. But it related to a very profound journey of your own, almost you becoming Dante in the work itself and experiencing Dante's journey through Dante's being from many different angles, and drawing all those experiences from various forms of history, various forms of art, technology, as well as visual art, as well as other forms of art. There was certainly a dimension of sound in, for example, just to pick one example, the City of Heaven, the birds, for example. One has to ask, well, what's the sound of it? There's a sense of all of the senses being involved as well. And I wonder if that resonates for you, because I felt that kind of fusion or hybrid of various dimensions was a primary aspect of your work as I experienced it, looking back at the slides. But does that resonate for you at all?
Sure. And we went through the whole process of making the movie, which also had to be edited and had sound and music and everything. So we went through the same process and working with the composer, imagining sound effects and everything. So
How did you find the sound effects? Through the composer, or was it in dialogue or collaboration?
how did we?
Well, for example,
We thought of which sounds to put.
Did the composer bring the sounds to you, or did you have discussions and interactions leading
More
to...
discussion. The director was more about creating the soundscape. He did most of the sound that wasn't musical, as far as traffic noises and birds and things like you're saying.
So some was soundscape, and then some was composed music as well?
And we had original music written for it.
And for what kind of resources? What were the instruments, or was it voices, or both? Or
It was a band of
Band.
guys that we knew, and
Right,
they played
right.
four guys, and they sang, and they played all the instruments. And
right. So it was electric, amplified music.
yeah.
Not chamber music, acoustic chamber
No,
music so
and
much.
actually a lot of it was played on like toy instruments to
Oh.
go along with the idea of a toy theater, like
That's
a toy
very
piano. And
That's great. Oh, interesting. Yeah, because this was for 6 instruments with the voices that had the primary roles. But, of course, those are transformed through the 16 speakers as well. So it seems like a much larger ensemble, even though it's only 6 playing.
Are there other questions from the floor, or one of the panelists who would like to respond to how the presentations jarred them? There's one right there.
I have a question for Sandow. Is your Beatrice pregnant, and why?
No, she's not.
I didn't know if that was like rude to ask.
But I did.
My students always ask that.
Well, I thought about it just like I set the premise that the whole thing's happening in the real world, and so I thought, I was very aware of whatever decision I made could be second guessed, what race you choose Beatrice, or what color her hair is, or something. But then I thought she should look sort of Italian, and then I imagined what is it like for all of us. We had our first love when we were 15, and then you go to the class reunion 30 years later. What does she look like? She looked older, and she gained some weight, and not quite what you remember in your head.
Yes. Yeah.
Question is, how do you envision the order of experience of your ideal spectator, reader, between the Dante itself and your work? Do you expect, or would you like your work to be a gateway for Dante, or vice versa? You want first Dante and then you. It's for all of that. All of it.
While you're thinking, I'm just going to say the last 10 years when I've taught Sandow's version next to a traditional text. Both students show up every day with both. I've varied the traditional translation, and invariably half of the class becomes attached to reading the traditional one first, and Sandow's other ones become attached to reading Sandow's first as their gateway in, and then they argue back and forth about which is best. And so that's been fascinating. So, Sandow, you're looking like you want to say something.
Well, for me, coming to Dante without any scholarly background, the really frustrating thing to me when I very first started reading it was that I would start reading it, and you couldn't get through a page without you had to stop, and you had to go to the footnotes, and you had to learn who the Ghibellines were. And it was just so annoying that there was just so many interruptions. And so when I set out to work with Marcus, we wanted to make a text that you would read it right through in English, and that all the information would be included into the text. So it would sort of explain who they were as you're reading. That was sort of a real simple goal of ours. And we always we had no high aspirations for our project, except that it would be the first thing that you might stumble on, and it would suck you into be really interested in Dante for real.
What? Okay, if I understood it correctly, you are asking if we think that our translation, for example, the translations that I read in Sicilian, should be read with thinking about Dante or making a comparison? Or which one first? Okay, as I don't know if when I was reading you could listen the musicality of Sicilian and how the poem was like. For me, some of them they achieve such a musicality that you can think about it as a separate poem. And others that were not, because the one that I was reading was made by a poet. And he also translated from French. He was in contact with other European writers of his epoch. And so he was one who was into the literary field. Others were doctors, lawyers, and so they didn't achieve such a musicality, and sometimes in their translation you can lose some metaphors or also the moral implication of some verses because they are thought to be read from common people. But I think that Sicilian as a poetic language has a musicality on its own right.
For me, it would be in all directions at once. So the gateway could go from my work to Dante or Dante to my work, and at any point along the way, take a direct route and say reading one canto into my work from Dante and then back into Dante and then to another, even by reference and then back in. And that kind of journey really appeals to me. And I thought about that actually as I was writing the piece.
Sessions of all the papers that we've heard today have the great virtue of reminding us of our own points of entry, of our own points of reference. If you're learning Dante and you're a scholar, then you want to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the text, and the text becomes the be-all and the end-all. But then when you read translations, when you think of Dante in a translatory mode, you find that instead of that centrifugal force, you're forced to recognize that there is a centrifugal force. There's an energy that is moving out from the poem into its new form. And that form has its own artistic integrity and its aesthetics and its appeal and its ideology. And what it really does create for us is this sort of bifocal Beniamini and stance that we can, the experience that you described, Peter, going to Sando's exhibition, that's the moment where we become aware of how much we presuppose about our own relationship with the Divine Comedy, and new avenues open up for it.
May I give a postscript? I was in New York after I met Sandow and so on, and I was in a bookstore in the West Village, and I wanted to see if the Paradiso was out in paperback. So I was heading toward it, and there was a couple who looked Italian to me, who were heading for it. We converged in front of Sandow's Paradiso, and we struck up a little conversation, and they asked me if I thought that Sandow might translate his translation into Italian, because they had heard about it and they wanted to share it with their fellows. So translation goes many ways, isn't it?
Isn't that a sort of trope of the event of meaning? Isn't meaning constructed in the counter always? In this case, there is a production of another work.
And they had been the victims of a liceo classico tradition, So the poem was dead on arrival, but by turning his pages, it was new. It moved on.
I have a specific question for Cristina. Have there been recently a lot of translations into Sicilian? In the English-speaking world, over the last 20 years, I've been astounded at how many translations of Dante there have been. Every single poet seems to want to try his or her hand at translating Dante.
And every single Dante stuff. Except me.
Every spoon perhaps. But, this is implying that there's an audience as well, that the poem has generated such interest in itself that translations of it, and I find it absolutely fascinating that even in Italy, that the translate. So that's my first question. Have there been a spate of recent translations into Sicily? And do you know of any into Sicily? And do you know of any other kinds of translations into other dialects in Italy? Is there a Neapolitan version?
Okay, so to reply to your first question, the most recent one is the one made by a poet, by Rosa Gazzaro Siciliano, and it's of the 1986, and she translated the whole poem, and I was actually working also in the analysis of her translation too, because it's interesting if you have noticed that, first of all, we have, it seems that we have three major poles. One is Palermo, the other one is Messina, and then there is Catania. And so it is interesting when you are analyzing the translations to make a comparison and to look at the evolution of the dialect and to the word choices that sometimes if you read, for example, also Rosa Gazzaro Siciliano, you can notice that her Sicilian, even if is the same of Tommaso Cannizzaro, so she came from the same town, is different because, as you know, it's a language and it evolves. And we still speak Sicilian, and so it constantly changes. And then, for example, to think about the audience, Padre Domenico Canalella didn't publish the whole translation. He published it in installments, and so it was readable by the public in newspapers. And it was recently published in 2003 by Nuova Ipsa, and you can find also ebook. And so, but at the same time, it's something that you have. It's not published. People in Sicily, when I was speaking about my thesis project here, no one knew about the translations into Sicilian dialect, and so I became interested because I knew that there was one that was the most famous one, Carlo Porta in Milanese, and so I discovered that then there was one. There are many in every dialect. I think that I don't want to say something that isn't like that, but I think that every region has at least one translation in its own dialect. And another one who is recently being analyzed is the one in Calabrese by Giuseppe Basile. And it's interesting because when you read the preface and the dedications, you can find that there are some kind of common topics, like I want to see if my dialect can achieve the same high level of Dante, and others who says, I think that no, at least the other prefaces that I read, no one was talking about Dante as the prince of dialectal poets. This was surprising, and and for example, in Sicily there was also in the preface there was also a kind of pride because they were talking about their dialect as the first one, as the first literary dialect in Italy, and so they were trying to make a sort of tradition and to refer to the Vulgario Eloquentia, and also, for example, to the recent Meli, the poet, and so they were trying to find a kind of canon in its own right in Sicily. And I don't remember the second question. I don't know if I replied.
You did.
Yeah. Okay.
I just have a quick. Could I make a quick comment that it just struck me that in a sense there is a very direct connection between our work, because in a sense every performance is a dialect unto itself. And when you're talking about taking a work such as I described with the 16 sets of speakers in a very particular kind of space, and also performing it as an oratorio in a large hall, it is almost like a new dialect, the translation of the work. And I find that very interesting that there is that parallel between making translations in language and then also through performative art as well.
My question is, did you have any concerns about using this foundational text one translation by Divinity from German into English and applying it to three different works from Italian into English? And I ask this because I know that there are at least two different translations of the Divinity article in English, and there's been some controversy about the different translations. For example, you point out this really important part about the fragments of the vessel, and these fragments of translations coming together to a totality. And in fact, some other critiquers of this translation, Paul Demont, for example, says that these are not actually what Divinity is saying, that they're not into a totality, that these fragments remain fragments. So what are your concerns about these really labyrinth-like territories of translation, and discoursing it all in English then?
That is a complicated question, and I appreciate it. It's definitely something I've considered about, because I know in the other translation, he uses words like embryonic, for example, that may be more productive in that translation to consider what sort of fruits come out of that. This is, I sort of skipped over it, but this is a work in progress. So definitely I need to think about that. Only if I spoke German as well as I spoke Italian, then this would be a lot more honest, I suppose, in the process. So in considering that sort of translation of translation of translation, I think that Benjamin might actually be okay with it, because I'm sort of taking all of these fragmentary pieces and trying to put them together to sort of deconstruct the image that we have of a dantista and the translation. But definitely I need to make sure to acknowledge the problematic relationship that translation emerges in this discourse. Thank you.
No, you're good. Yes.
So my question is that as everyone was talking, I kept hearing these words of Dante echo in my head from the Convivio, that he had chosen his mother tongue because of its montale propria e prossimitale a me, its inherent goodness or worth and its closeness to me. Artists go to art. You're going to adapt Dante into art. If I were a fiber artist, I would be quilting a Dante. And a musician will make Dante into music. And a dantista will make Dante into his, if not native tongue, at least his professional tongue, which is usually a higher register than sometimes the poem wants to go, as you pointed out yesterday. And I was thinking about Allison's claim thesis, which I really agree with, and which Simone summarized as Dante would not merely accept, but embrace the necessity of the translation of his poem so that it would be able to live for the gente futura, futura gente, excuse me. And I think that what I was trying to pull all of these disparate pieces into one volume, the notion that in order to encounter the poem, you really have to appropriate it in your dialect, in your art form, in your language, in where you are at the time that you read it. And the thrill of being able to teach it year in and year out is that it's always changing, because we're always changing. And that it's a moving target, and it's because we are growing and moving targets, but we come at it through the language that has intrinsic goodness and closeness to the reader, whether that's the Sicilian dialect for you or poetry for you. And
synergy of the different approaches on this roundtable, analytical, creative, reflective, and all of those together has for me been really kind of electrifying because it connects with all the talks that we've heard that have been reflective and analytical as well. So this was just what I was hoping for, but I just want more and more and more of it. So you just have to keep talking until the cows come home. Yes, there isn't a question.
Those sound like great concluding remarks. That's where we should start.
The telltale compression of the pages before you and the telltale clanking of the wheelie carts and bottles next to us would suggest that we are about to be able to be let loose upon an unsuspecting bar and an unsuspecting table of goodies. Of course, I want to thank everyone for coming and for listening to me think out loud in response to some phenomenal stimuli that it will take me a long time to process. I'm just going to, with that thanks, hand the mic over to Warren.
Ditto.
Oh, stop it. No fair.
It really does send us back to the, I guess really the request from Albert, if we would be silly enough to undertake the sponsoring and the hosting of this meeting of the Dante Society. We really said yes immediately, but I will just echo what Gina said. We couldn't possibly have hoped for the outcome to be as extraordinarily stimulating as it has been. Each of the talks, in its own way, was just so provocatively intellectually challenging. It opened up avenues. It was almost a performance of translation of itself, in that it was transporting and transforming us in the audience as much, as I think it did those who wrote it. So we could not have been happier, I think, than we are now. The results of this meeting, and just don't ask us to do it again.
Gina and Warren as we were talking now, but I want to make sure that we really applaud them for all of the work that they put into it, and all of you for coming, but especially Gina and Warren.